Smoke still hung in the cold air, the kind that stings the throat and refuses to drift away. Somewhere behind the concrete walls, German radios crackled with half-formed reports. Outside, American tanks were already moving. This was not how a fortress was supposed to die. On November the 18th, 1944, the fall of Metz began, not with a siege, not with patience, but with speed. At the center of the defense stood Fort Driant, a 6-foot-thick shell of reinforced concrete built to absorb direct hits from heavy bombers. Around it stretched a ring of 17 major forts, their underground tunnels and interlocking guns designed in the 19th century, upgraded for modern war, and studied for years by German planners. The verdict from Berlin was unwavering. Metz would hold for months, possibly until spring. At 9 a.m., General George S. Patton shattered that assumption. Instead of encircling the city and grinding it down, American infantry and armor surged forward at once. The defenders were not fully manned. They were still thinking in weeks. Patton was thinking in hours. 48 hours later, the swastika would be hauled down from the citadel. Metz did not fall because the Americans were stronger. It fell because they moved faster than fortress logic could comprehend. When you believe you are invulnerable, you defend accordingly. And when an enemy refuses to accept that belief, concrete turns out to be just another position, not a miracle. Metz sat astride the Moselle River in eastern France, fortified layer by layer over centuries. Each of its 17 forts was a self-contained world, complete with artillery, garrisons, and buried supply lines. Germany had held the city since 1940. For 4 years, defenses were refined, minefields laid, guns pre-sighted, fire zones overlapped with mathematical precision. American intelligence predicted 2 months of methodical siege warfare. Patton allowed 2 days. Before dawn on November the 18th, the 12th Corps advanced from multiple directions. Siege doctrine said isolate the fortress, starve it, then reduce it. Patton rejected that logic. He intended to punch through, overwhelm the system, and take the city before the defenders could even finish mobilizing. Infantry moved first, probing under darkness for weak seams. Armor idled in assembly areas, engines humming. At roughly 6 miles out, American artillery erupted, not with days of bombardment, but a sharp, violent barrage aimed at specific strongpoints identified as vulnerable. 90 minutes later, the guns fell silent. German defenders waited for the pause. It never came. Before dust settled, American infantry and tanks were already advancing. Command posts had no time to assess damage, no time to redirect reserves. The 5th Infantry Division struck from the south. The 90th pressed from the east. The 95th drove toward the northern forts. Armor from the 10th Armored Division waited to exploit any crack. The concept was simple: hit everywhere, move too fast for coordination, find a weak point and flood it before it could be sealed. By noon, the outer ring was under assault from all sides. Fort Driant still held firm, but smaller positions were cracking. German communications strained under the volume of requests. Artillery calls piled up faster than fire direction centers could process them. Reserves were already committed elsewhere. The fortress had been built for a different war. At 3 p.m., infantry from the 90th Division found a gap in the eastern defenses. No explosion, no heroic charge. A minefield seam was marked, companies flowed through, and within an hour, an entire battalion was inside the outer ring. Counterattack orders went out, but the assigned units were already engaged. A platoon arrived where a company was needed. By nightfall on the first day, 3 breaches existed. The fortress was no longer sealed. American armor waited just beyond the gaps. The garrison commander sent his report. Defense holding, pressure severe, immediate reinforcements requested. The reply was blunt: no reinforcements available, hold current positions. The fortress was alone, and it had 1 day left. November the 19th opened with Americans already occupying ground the Germans expected to fight over for weeks. There was no meaningful pause. Patton's directive was uncompromising: maintain pressure, no reorganization, keep moving. At first light, infantry widened the breaches. The 5th Division slipped between southern forts, masked by fog and terrain. German guns fired blindly into the haze, shells bursting in empty fields. The Americans were already past the impact zones. By 8 a.m., lead elements entered the southern suburbs of Metz. The defensive plan was obsolete before breakfast. In the north, the 95th Division bypassed Fort Plappeville, leaving a blocking force while the main body drove for the Moselle bridges. Doctrine said never bypass a fortress. Patton's doctrine said if it cannot stop you, ignore it. The fort held 1,000 men and months of supplies, and zero mobility. Once passed, it no longer mattered. The decisive collapse came in the east. The 90th Division pushed armor through the previous day's breach. Sherman tanks rolled down roads meant to be swept by interlocking fire, but coordination had failed. Phone lines were cut, radios choked with traffic. Fort commanders acted independently, widening the gaps between their guns. At 11 a.m., a combat command from the 10th Armored Division entered Metz from the east. Tanks were now in city streets. This was the garrison's nightmare. Forts were built to stop enemies outside the walls, not armor already behind them. Patton had inverted the battle, penetrating the center while the perimeter still fought. The Moselle bridges became critical. Destroy them and the advance slowed. Save them and armor would pour through. Engineers raced forward under fire. At the northern bridge, they arrived 30 seconds before German charges could be detonated. Wire cutters snapped. The bridge stood. Tanks crossed immediately. By afternoon, American armor operated on both banks of the river inside the city. The fortress was not being reduced, it was being enveloped. At 4 p.m., the commander of Fort Bellecroix reported American tanks moving freely south of his position. He requested instructions. The response came late and useless. Hold your position. Holding meant nothing once the war had moved past you. By evening, Metz was unraveling. Fortress rings designed for layered defense had become isolated pockets. Americans controlled intersections, bridges, and main routes. German units remained intact but disconnected. Orders reached formations already bypassed. Retreat routes marked on maps were blocked by American roadblocks established hours earlier. Street fighting erupted across the city, fast, violent, and decentralized. This was not a grinding urban siege. Infantry cleared a block. Armor surged to the next intersection. The advance never paused. Resistance continued, but coherence was gone. Fort Driant, the anchor, was now encircled. No direct assault was needed. Roads, supply lines, and observation points were controlled. Its guns could fire, but they had no eyes, no coordination, and no support. At 6 p.m., its commander received orders to hold at all costs. He studied his map and understood the truth. Hold meant nothing when isolation was complete. The citadel became the last functioning command post. Reports painted a single picture. American tanks in industrial districts, infantry at the rail station, roadblocks on every major artery. The fortress commander, General Hermann Balck, made the calculation every defender dreads. Metz could not be held. Continued resistance would only increase casualties. At 10 p.m. on November the 19th, surrender terms were drafted. Even then, fighting continued. Isolated units kept resisting, unaware the city had already fallen. Fortresses did exactly what they were built to do, long after the battle they belonged to was over. On November the 20th, 48 hours after the first assault, American forces controlled central Metz. The citadel was surrounded. Outer forts stood intact but irrelevant. Negotiations unfolded amid disbelief. German officers under white flags met American commanders still in assault mode, still expecting resistance. Fort Driant held until mid-morning, not from strength but from ignorance. When informed the city was lost, its commander fell silent. The fort had food, ammunition, and walls that could last weeks, but there was nothing left to defend. At noon, 500 men marched out. Similar scenes followed. Fort Bellecroix surrendered in the afternoon. Fort Jeanne d'Arc held until evening, then capitulated when American armor demonstrated it could simply bypass and starve the position. Each commander faced the same truth. Their forts were strong and strategically meaningless. By nightfall, organized resistance in Metz had ended. Patton's Third Army prepared to push east. The fortress meant to delay the Allies for months had fallen in 2 days. Casualties were lower than expected. American losses were under 1,000. German losses were heavier but not catastrophic. The forts remained largely intact. What had been destroyed was an idea. The defenders had walls, guns, tunnels, and time, or so they believed. What they lacked was the ability to react faster than Patton could strike. Fortress warfare assumes months. Patton compressed that calendar into hours. Isolation and assault occurred together. Artillery and infantry followed each other by minutes, not days. Every German response arrived late. By the time fire was requested, Americans had moved. By the time reinforcements were ordered, the crisis had shifted elsewhere. The forts were not weak. Fort Driant could have resisted frontal assault indefinitely. The tunnel systems were engineering marvels, but all were designed for a war Patton refused to fight. He bypassed instead of reducing, penetrated instead of isolating, attacked before defenses were fully manned. Metz proved that in modern warfare, mobility defeats fortification, not because walls are useless, but because speed decides when and where walls matter. The city had every defensive advantage imaginable. What it did not have was time. The walls stood, the defenders fought, and it still was not enough because Patton was already inside before the fortress understood the battle had begun. In the end, Metz offered a simple lesson that echoed far beyond its concrete walls. When speed collides with immobility, time chooses the winner.